because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot of
Welcome, everyone, to Science From the Fringe. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm excited to be joined today by Matt Ridley. Matt is a best-selling author, science writer, and one of the sharpest thinkers on evolution, innovation, and the evolution of ideas, or what I would refer to as a public intellectual. His books, including The Red Queen, Genome, The Rational Optimist, and How Innovation Works, have transformed how millions view science and human progress. In 2021, he wrote a bestseller called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19 with Alina Chan, which sparked global debate on the pandemic's origins. His latest book, Birds, Sex, and Beauty, The Extraordinary Implications of Charles Darwin's Strangest Idea, focus on Darwin's theory of sexual selection, mate choice in birds, and its broader evolutionary implications. Matt, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Bryce. That was a very smart introduction. Made me sound very clever, but never mind.
Well, we'll get to, this idea of smart introduction and people being smart and how that affects, their ability to mate is part of the book you recently wrote, correct? That's why I'm trying to, anyway.
I've been successfully mated to the same person for 35 years, so I'm done on that. I'm content with what I've achieved.
Well, and again, I guess one thing I did want to point out that there are a lot of children that are fans of Science from the Fringe. So we want to keep it clean today, Matt, because I know your book gets into some interesting, sexual selection, I guess, is potentially a topic that we need to keep an age limit on. But to be serious, let's
in birds, not so
birds. Well, that's true. So I wanted to begin though by talking about the stuff. Obviously, we came to know each other because of your work on COVID origins. Eventually, that led to you joining the organization that I founded with Richard Ebright and Justin Kinney called Biosafety Now. I wanted to ask you what your current thoughts are on where things stand with respect to the fight for truth about COVID origins.
Well, it's a really good question, and one that I'm very exercised about still. I mean, we're 5 years now, pretty well exactly, since this. No, 6 years now since it began in the fall of 2019, and I think we have comprehensively won the argument, settled the issue that it almost certainly, or at least probably, began with a laboratory accident in Wuhan. That's with most people. But with the scientific establishment, with Nature magazine, Science magazine, the Royal Society in London, the National Academy in the American Academy in Washington, we have not won the argument. There is still a holdout of professional scientists at the top of their profession who are saying, well, we don't know and we'll never know, and it's better that we never know because it might annoy the Chinese regime or it might damage the reputation of science if we admitted that there was a lab leak. And so there is this desire for the issue to fade away into history unsettled. Now, even if it's only a 10% chance that this began with a lab leak, 20 million people dead is 1,000 times worse than Bhopal. It's 1,000 times worse than the next worst industrial accident. And it's therefore absolutely incumbent on us to say, how the heck might this have happened, even if we're not sure it did happen? And I'm pretty distressed about the fact that the guys who want this to fade away are to some extent winning. It is kind of fading into the rearview mirror. And although the vast majority of people I meet say, "Oh, you persuaded me, I've changed," or "You must have won that argument," I would like to see a more determined effort by people in universities, people in governments, people in business around the world to settle this question once and for all as to what happened to kill 20 million people over a few years, 5 or 6 years ago.
Matt, what does winning actually look like on this issue? Because you use the term winning.
Yeah, and it's an unfortunate word. I shouldn't have used that word probably because it makes it sound like it's a game that I would enjoy winning. For me, it's always been and I'd always much rather we found that this was just a stupid mistake in a food market. That would be much more comfortable for my worldview. I'm pro biotechnology, pro science, but I think science has to be honest with itself. And if there is no good evidence that anything started in that one seafood market that had a connection to the early cases of the epidemic, and if there is good evidence that they were doing extraordinarily relevant experiments in that one city in the world and nowhere else, and at no other time, then I think that evidence has to be looked at. What would winning look like? Let's not say winning. What would concluding look like? It would be an admission by somebody who was in the room at the time that they had a virus in that lab that they were working on, and that they were doing an experiment, probably to put a furin cleavage site into its spike gene, with the intention of testing it on humanized mice. And then even if they can't say that they definitely know how a researcher got infected, if they think it was a pretty likely possibility, then I think we can say, right, we know the answer.
I guess, yeah, it's not necessarily winning per se. It's just providing the public with truth, or as close to the truth as we can
Well,
possibly.
I think the truth's a really important thing. I like the truth. I prefer it to falsehoods, and I prefer it to not knowing. I keep coming back to this one casual conversation I had with a very senior scientist in the UK, a wonderful man, and he said to me, because he'd actually had a bet that there would be a bio accident that would kill 1 million people before 2020, and he for the end of 2020. So I said, you won your bet. Look at the evidence, and he said, well, I suppose you're right, but I'd much rather we didn't know. Now, just imagine saying that about a plane crash. There's a plane crash outside an airport, and a couple of hundred people are dead in horrific circumstances. And somebody comes on the radio or the television and says, it's better we don't find out because that might upset Boeing, or it might upset Airbus, or it might upset the airline, or something like that. That would be a grotesque thing to say. And this is far bigger than that. It's 10,000 times as big. And therefore, it just feels to me very odd not to want the truth and to put a huge amount of effort into getting the truth. As far as I can see, the British government, the American government, the World Health Organization have put very little money, let alone effort, into trying to find out what happened. The intelligence services have done a bit, journalists have done a bit, but most of the running, as you know, has been made by some talented amateurs who, have done it on their own dime and in their own time. People like Prasenjit Ray in India, and Francisco Ribera in Spain, and Gilles Demeneuf in New Zealand, and a bunch of others like that. It's a remarkable little episode in the history of humanity that we have not done our duty in truth-seeking here.
One thing you have said before, though, about the scientific community on this issue is you said the church is not admitting what it got wrong. So how do you sort of square the idea that the scientific community is acting more like a religious entity than what it's supposed to be with your love for science?
I see two different things here. One is science as a philosophy, and that's great. That's fine. That's in great shape. It's humanity's greatest achievement, bar none, and it will continue to be. And the other is science as an institution, and that is corrupt and disgraceful and probably worse than it's been in 100 years in those respects. I think the way to think about this is to think about confirmation bias, which is the sort of biggest source of bias in the way we solve problems in the world. In other words, confirmation bias is we look for evidence to support our hunches, not for evidence to disprove our hunches. And you can find tons of evidence that is consistent with what you think, and you think you've helped prove your point, and actually you haven't. You need to go out there and really test your idea by looking for evidence that would knock your theory down. Now, nobody does that. You can't expect people to do that, really. That it's just not human, and you can't even expect scientists to do it. And we've kind of known that for a couple of hundred years, that this is a problem. And the way science solved that problem, in my view, sometime in the 20th century mainly, was by saying, let's decentralize science. Let's have a whole bunch of different universities working on similar problems so that Professor A can get up in the morning one day and say, Professor B at a rival institution is talking complete nonsense, and I'm going to prove it. And so challenging yourself was never realistic, but challenging others was a realistic part of science. Now, I think that has atrophied. I think it's really hard for Professor B to talk about Professor A spouting nonsense when they're both funded by the same stream of money. In the case we're talking about, the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, where Anthony Fauci, as head of it, was transmitting a very clear view on what the answer to this question was, the origin of COVID. But this has happened in other fields too. This has happened with Alzheimer's research, with a bunch of other things, where the one consensus view has been enforced like, as you say, a religious dogma. And if you step out of line on that, not only does your funding cease, but you are cancelled, drummed out of the academy, treated like a heretic. You're burnt at the stake, not literally, of course, but metaphorically. And that there's always been a tendency for scientists to do this. And only occasionally has it got really bad. Lysenko in the Soviet Union being a classic example where, Vavilov ended up dying in prison because he was trying to stand up for Mendelian genetics against this complete crank, Trofim Lysenko. But why was Lysenko able to do that? Because he had a monopolistic system, the Stalinist government, to enforce his dogmatic view of genetics. So the enemy here is monopoly. The enemy here is centralization. And that is what's been happening to science. It's been getting more and more centralized and therefore more and more dogmatic in the way it insists on one view of controversial questions. So that's a bit of a harangue there, Bryce, but it's my view of what's gone wrong.
Your view then might argue against having an NIH, right? Having government-funded science, which in the case of the U.S. with the NIH has sort of become this dominant it's the dominant form of funding science. But as you just pointed out, it can create a problem where you have one or two individuals determining like the entire, where the fields go.
Yeah, we need to trust bust here. 100 years ago, the US people said, hang on, we don't like these big monopolies. We don't like US Steel or the big railroads or whatever. They need to be broken up, or Standard Oil. It's the same problem. It's monopoly that's the problem. And we forget about government being a monopoly because we assume it has to be, but it doesn't have to be. You could easily fragment the funding system and do it through the states or through other devolved institutions, and put in place mechanisms to make sure that they don't all end up singing from the same song sheet. So in the UK, we do actually have two rather than one big funding streams for biomedical research. One is the government, and the other is the Wellcome Trust, which is just a huge private charitable foundation. So in theory, that's great, but in practice, they just completely sing from the same song sheet and hire the same people and go to the same conferences, and they end up being just as dogmatically aligned with each other. So it's not working there. But I do think that if scientists had lots of different potential funding streams, some of which were avowedly heretical, they were saying, right, we're going to support mavericks. We're going to support people who generally get trashed by their colleagues. Now, occasionally such an institution is going to make a mistake and it's going to support a complete crank who's saying something idiotic. More than occasionally, he's probably going to do that quite often. But it's worth it because, all great scientific ideas start out as mavericks. To go back to 1953, right? What was the consensus then about what genes were made of? Protein, right? It was an absolute, widely held consensus. And there were a few nutters who said, I don't know, they might be made of DNA. And this guy, Oswald Avery, had been doing these experiments at Rockefeller, which actually proved very nicely that genes were made of DNA, but he'd been hammered by his colleagues for this ridiculous heresy, and they'd picked holes in his experiments and said, no, it doesn't prove anything of the sort. Genes are made of protein. You can't make genes out of DNA. DNA is just the sort of scaffold on which you build a protein gene, right? And these two guys, Watson and Crick, with the help of work by Rosalind Franklin and Raymond Gosling and Maurice Wilkins, the story is well known, eventually said, here's the structure of DNA, and this proves that it is actually carrying the key information that a gene carries. And eventually they cracked the whole genetic code. Now, if the consensus had been allowed to say nobody may study or be funded to study DNA as the gene, they must stick to proteins because that's what we know to be true, then the world would have been held back in making a very important discovery, probably the most important scientific discovery of the 20th century, bar none, in my view.
Jane Goodall would be another example.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. That she was saying, apes can be tool makers. Everyone said, don't be ridiculous, humans are tool makers. And she went out and proved them wrong. Now, just because all great scientists start out as mavericks doesn't mean that all mavericks are great scientists, of course. 90% of mavericks are nutters and deserve to be left in the dustbin of history. But that's the conundrum we've got, is how to allow enough space for the mavericks who are going to change history.
But Matt, now, of course, like one of the effective tools that's been used in the COVID origins debate, and sadly has been effective, it has been to try to like deplatform or like accuse people like yourself of being nutters or conspiracy theorists, and in doing so to dismiss the valid points that you and others are making. So it is kind of, interesting to see not interesting, it's an unfortunate state of science where name calling and like false accusations has been very effective at keeping people quiet in the scientific community.
Well, you saw it with the determined, all across the media, decision to call the lab leak theory a conspiracy theory, to ban it from even being discussed on Facebook, to downplay it on Twitter. This was happening till well into 2021, when there was a bit of a rethink and they began to realize they'd gone too far with this. But as you say, it wasn't just the cancelling and the censoring; it was also the name calling. Some of the things that tenured academic professional virologists were saying about me personally, some of them were completely made up, but they were just unbelievably puerile, sort of playground chants about how I was a jerk in some way. It didn't bother me, when you're taking flak, you're over the target, as they used to say in the Air Force in World War II. But it did surprise me. I mean, I expect that kind of troll-like behavior, which I still get, by the way. I expect that kind of troll-like behavior from, fringe eccentrics on social media. But to get it from tenured academics in proper universities, that was just, really, how lowering can you get in terms of trying to damage the reputation of experts?
Well, I think the simple explanation for why that happens is it's effective. It's extremely effective.
Well, you're right. People just hear the insult and say, oh, he's a nutter, is he? Right. Okay.
And in part, this is the way in which it prevents people from talking. Like when your book came out with Alina, one of the ways in which you were, like the book was attacked and you were attacked was because of your, positions on climate change or misrepresentations of your positions on climate change. And that was a very effective way because again, most of the scientific community is like it's heresy to question anything about the fact that climate change is an existential threat and we're all going to die if we don't do something. Um, and the labeling of you as like a climate change denier and whatnot, that's very effective at keeping people away from not just your statements on that subject, but on your statements on other subjects, in this case, COVID origins. So
Yeah. Well, the word denier was, of course, introduced into that debate specifically to link people like me to Holocaust denial, which is, a ridiculous nonsense. Um, and I have never denied anything about climate change, but I have over 40 years of covering it. I first wrote about man-made climate change in The Economist in 1987, which is not quite 40 years, 38 years ago. And I've written about it on and off ever since. Over that time, I have come to the view that yes, it's real. Yes, it's man-made. Yes, it's caused by human emissions to a large extent. And yes, it's an issue we need to discuss, but no, it is not a huge existential threat that requires doing real damage to the world economy. And the cost-benefit side of this thing has been damaged. Has been mistaken, as it were, and needs to be redressed. Now, that doesn't make me a denier of anything, but it was portrayed by some of my critics as being somebody who didn't believe in climate change. Well, I don't believe in anything, but I do think climate change is happening. So you're right. That then was used to damage my view on this. Here he is being heretical on a different subject. Well, I don't think I am being heretical on climate change. I'm just trying to criticize those who exaggerate it. And likewise on the lab leak, I've never once thought that it was, that I wanted desperately for it to be a lab leak. I thought, well, all the time we were writing our book, I thought we were going to come up with good hard evidence that it was the market, and we were going to be able to say, okay, case closed. Here's what actually happened. Still very important, still very interesting, still enough for a bestseller, but not actually sinister in the sense that it wasn't a lab leak. And in fact, that never happened. The reverse happened. We got stronger and stronger evidence of the lab leak, and we were honest enough to say so. The name. Now, it's worth considering. I'm 67 years old. I'm a very, very old man. I'm semi-retired. I still write, but I don't have a job. I don't answer to any institution. I'm not employed by anyone. So what I say can damage no organization's reputation. Now, most people are not in that position. Most people, if they were saying some of the things I was saying about either climate change or the lab leak, would have to stop and think, oh, is this going to get my employer into trouble? Is this going to get me into trouble in my university? Is this going to prevent me being promoted or something like that? I'm in a situation where I have no more, I can't use the word, to give.
It's okay. It's fine. Kids actually don't watch this, Matt, so you can curse all
no
you.
more F's to give.
Right.
And that's part of the censoring that's going on, is that other people are not in that position. And that's partly why I felt the responsibility to take on an issue like this, because I thought, look, I can risk my reputation here. I can go out and embrace the need to look into whether this was a lab leak and put my neck on the line, because I'm not putting anyone else's careers at risk by doing so. It's a much tougher decision for Alina Chan, incredibly brave woman, brilliant woman, right at the start of a great career in science, also a very good writer, and a commentator on these issues. And I was incredibly lucky to be able to team up with her, and I think we made a good team in tackling this. She's obviously knows the ins and outs of viruses, genomics, and biomedicine generally better than I do, but she's also got beautiful manners, has never been rude about anybody on social media, even when hugely tempted. She's a very remarkable human being, and and undoubtedly, there are a lot of people in science now who have knives out for her and want to make sure she never gets a chance to have a career in science because of the way she investigated whether it was a lab leak. That's a travesty. That's shocking to me.
Before we talk about your book, I wanted to talk about another topic that, in my opinion, relates to COVID origins in a sense, that what's emerged out of COVID origins and the sort of cover-up of the potential lab origin of the virus has been a lot of distrust amongst the public in scientists. And that, I think, will bleed into many other obviously, it's bled into vaccines and the climate issue. There's a lot of issues where now many members of the public are less trusting on what scientists are claiming they know. And that's going to, I think, cause a lot of problems in the future. And I think that's one of the reasons I like talking to you, because you support science and you are a champion of science, and you're, I think, trying to push against, or not push against, but to make a convincing argument that we do, in fact, need science to better society. One topic that will be, I think, very controversial and is not as sort of well discussed is this idea of de-extinction. And you recently wrote a op-ed in The Spectator about the efforts of de-extinction efforts of a company called Colossal. Do you mind talking about that briefly? Just mention what your views are on de-extinction and what you've seen in that space recently.
Yeah, I'd delight to. And just to your general point, I do think that science must have a much more honest self-examination of whose fault it is that trust in experts was damaged by the pandemic. I think modelers, those who overclaimed for the vaccines, those who demanded lockdowns when the evidence wasn't great that they would help, etc., have got a lot to answer for. When I hear scientists say it's disgraceful that people won't accept vaccines now, I think, well, whose fault is that? You shouldn't have said this stops transmission and it's safe for kids under 5, even when COVID's not dangerous for them. There was dreadful overclaiming for vaccines. At the time, I said, be careful, we're going to damage the reputation of this incredibly useful technology. Anyway, sorry, you wanted to talk about de-extinction.
Well, it's all related, Matt. Honestly,
Yeah.
The thing is, we're just as you say, going back to this, truth is the best way to get people to trust you. Just be honest. So
no, and I take the view that de-extinction is something we should pursue. It's almost a moral duty if it can be made to work and work safely. And that will be a harder argument to make after the pandemic than it would have been before, partly because of a man-made pandemic, if that's what it was, and partly because of the overclaiming by scientists. What do I know about this topic? Well, I've been peripherally involved in it for about 10 years. A wonderful couple in California, Ryan Phelan and Stuart Brand, are really the founders of this line of thinking, in my view. Stuart is, of course, a bit of a demigod in all the clever things he's said over the years about personal computers and all sorts of other topics. And they set up something called Revive and Restore, saying, and Ryan is a biotech entrepreneur, and they set up this thing called Revive and Restore and say, let's look at how we can de-extinguish some of the extinct species. And working with academics, particularly Beth Shapiro and Ben Novak and people like that, they began work on things like the passenger pigeon genome, which is this bird that went extinct 100 years ago or so. And I organized a meeting so that we could discuss something called the great auk, which is the only European breeding bird to go extinct in the last 500 years, a bird that bred in the North Atlantic on offshore islands and was flightless and was extinguished about 1840. Now, this isn't Jurassic Park. We're not going to bring back dinosaurs. That's never going to happen because, they're 65 million years old. But things that went extinct 100 years ago or so, the DNA is comparatively intact and can therefore be sequenced. And so the first thing we did for our Great Auk meeting was invite somebody who might be good at sequencing great auk to find out what he needed to get started, a guy called Tom Gilbert at Copenhagen. And he arrived and said, well, I've just done it. I've just sequenced the great auk genome. So the science was moving very fast 10 years ago. The idea of sequencing an extinct species genome was science fiction 15 years ago. It was science fact 10 years ago. The idea of editing a genome so that it looks like that of an extinct species, with the technologies that were just coming through, particularly CRISPR-based gene editing tools, was science fiction 10 years ago. It's not quite science fact 5 years ago, but it's looking more realistic. And today it's not far off. The latest versions coming out of MIT of CRISPR technologies, people like David Liu, you can put, 1,000 base pairs in a precise location, replacing a precise sequence. Well, we're beginning to get into the realms where we could talk about writing a great auk, passenger pigeon, dodo, mammoth genome, in the lab. And then, the next step is how to turn that into an embryo and how to release it and all that. And these are not insignificant problems, and we're not there yet. Colossal came along and said, we can do this in the private sector. We can raise several $1 billion to do it. And by Jove, they were right. They could raise several $1 billion, and they could employ a lot of these scientists. And the rest of us in the sort of non-profit end of this project sort of said, help, is that really the right way to go about it? And I think the jury's still out. On the one hand, this has given an enormous injection of funding into this research, which is going to drive it forwards. And why should the taxpayer pay for this kind of thing? It's not a bad idea to do it through the private sector. But on the other hand, in order to show some results for your shareholders, you as Colossal have got to sort of slightly hype up your transitional achievements along the way. And so last year they said they cloned not cloned, but recreated the dire wolf, which is an extinct species of wolf. Well, they haven't. They'd made 20 very significant changes to the genome of a wolf, which had made it look a heck of a lot more like a dire wolf, but that isn't quite a dire wolf. So there is a huge problem of hype coming out of Colossal. And that, for me, the concern there is that it will damage the reputation of the whole project. But suppose we do get to the point where we can produce a living great auk, passenger pigeon, dodo. I like birds, so I tend to think about birds, but the mammoth, the thylacine, the dire wolf are other examples. Is that morally okay? I think the answer is yes, because I think we extinguished these things. There's no reason to think they couldn't survive in the right conditions today. I mean, some of them would find it difficult to live alongside humanity today. But, take the great auk. The reason it died out was because we kept killing it and putting its feathers in pillows. Well, we could not do that. That's all we need to do, and then it could survive fine. There's plenty of fish in the North Atlantic for it to catch. In most places, there are problems with fish in some parts of the North Atlantic, but there's plenty of other auks are living in that area. So I think it's one of those cases where, in principle, this is not the wrong thing to be doing. And I just don't understand those who say, look, it's gone extinct. It's not our job to bring it back. It would be morally wrong in some way. I just don't buy that. But at the same time, we mustn't oversell it, and we mustn't forget to take the public along with us. And that's got a little bit harder because of what a bunch of virologists did in Wuhan in 2019.
I guess one of the concerns I have with this, and I'm maybe working, doing a lot of stuff with Justin Goodman and at White Coat Waste, and I don't know, there's a big concern about scientists and animal research and the abuse of animals in research. And so one of the things that immediately struck me with when Colossal was doing, putting out their sort of PR things, is the first thing they put out, I think, was a woolly mouse, right? Like they put some, and my original thought was like, my first thought to it was like, why? Like, what are we doing? Like, is this sort of like animal cruelty? And I do think scientists don't necessarily consider how many members of the public, when they're told about how animals are treated and used in labs, I don't think they think how outraged a lot of members of the public get about that. And so I do think with these de-extinction efforts, one of the sort of ethical and moral arguments about it might really not necessarily be about whether it's okay to bring it back if we're successful, but how we get there and what's the cost to, how many animals will suffer and how much, so that's something. And I don't know what your view is on that. But and frankly, I don't necessarily know what my opinion on that is, but I do think it is part of that ethical and moral discussion that needs to be had. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
I think that's a perfectly fair and very reasonable question, critique of this, and I think it is a challenge, and one that we need to take heavily. On the one hand, I could push back and say, look, nobody, what we're talking about doing is bringing an animal into healthy life. We're not talking about then experimenting on an adult sentient animal in any way. The experiments are all happening at the level of the cell or the embryo, not the extant animal, if you like.
Well, if you genetically modify an embryo and then have that, all I mean is like how many mutant animals?
How many will go wrong?
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I think that is a fair point, because imagine that you do, let's say, 50% of the genetic changes that you want to do in order to make a passenger pigeon, and you do it to a close relative. I can't remember it's called the bronze-tailed pigeon or something, the closest relative, to an embryo of that, and then you hatch an egg, and out comes a bird that looks a bit like a passenger pigeon, but it can't quite stand up because its legs are too short or its wings are too short or something, because you haven't quite got the whole package there. Then you're quite right. You have, in a sense, done something that is unethical or potentially unethical. And so I think that is going to be a really important consideration. That just because a whole passenger pigeon was a viable animal doesn't mean that a half passenger pigeon will be a viable animal. Now, and supposing you say, right, well, quite early on we spot this and we euthanize these creatures and start again and go to the next step, etc. That's not that different from what you're doing kind of all the time in labs with genetically modified mice, where you are doing these kinds of genetic modifications in order to try and solve human diseases. Now, I guess your riposte to me will be, yeah, but we're not trying to solve a human disease. So the cost benefit is not the same here. And I think, these are fair points, but it might be that this half passenger pigeon that I'm hypothesizing that they'll produce at some point is actually a perfectly viable thing. You wouldn't want to release it into the wild, but you could keep it happily in an aviary and breed from it and then start working on its offspring to make it more like a passenger pigeon. So you're right to be cautious, to challenge that point, but I think it may be one that can be answered.
Part of this for me stems from when I went to look at Colossal's website for the justification of bringing back the woolly mammoth. The justification was they wanted to have it like stomp the permafrost down and help with climate change. That to me is not a compelling reason to bring the woolly mammoth back. If you want to bring the woolly mammoth back, I don't think the justification for it is because it's going to stomp the permafrost and help with climate change. That just was my.
As you know, the way to get public approval and or money for anything these days is to say you're going to help solve climate change.
I know. And that's where,
No brainer. So
So
you're
it made me
absolutely right to be cynical there. But there is the kernel of a decent argument there, and
there
that
is.
is that
Okay.
is no, there
Okay.
is in eastern Siberia. There is this huge area of basically fir trees on moss with dense ice under it, so that the tree's roots can't get at the nutrients, so they don't grow very fast. It's a very, very unproductive habitat. And all the evidence suggests is that area was basically a sort of savanna-like grassland until really quite recently, um, with much richer productivity. And the reason for that was the existence of the mammoth, because the mammoth ate all the grasses, digested it, and its droppings were very fertile. And in eating off the vegetation, it allowed the sunlight to get at the earth, and that meant that the permafrost retreated a bit deeper, and that meant you had more soil nutrients, etc., etc. So the whole thing, you got a sort of virtuous circle. Take away the mammoth, and the whole thing collapsed. The ice came up, the trees came in instead of the grass, and so on. Now, I don't know how well established that theory is, but the theory is that you put mammoths back into eastern Siberia on a massive scale in a habitat where there's absolutely nothing else going on. A few reindeer herders might have to move out of the way, but not many. And you would get um, a, a whole new habitat emerging that could be rather wonderful for other species of flowers and insects and birds and things like that. Now, I suspect that's way too utopian, and it won't work nearly that well. But it's not completely bonkers.
So I want to turn now to talk about your newest book on a subject that you've been passionate about for decades, birds.
I've been a keen bird watcher since the age of dot. I mean, since 5 years old or something, and that was partly what got me interested in biology and hence in science generally. And particularly when I was doing my PhD at Oxford, I managed to find my way into a bird research institute and do my PhD on sexual behavior in birds. And this rather intriguing fact that birds are often very colorful in a way that mammals are not. I mean, we're boring creatures. We're brown, basically, mammals. Very rarely do we have any bright colors. Think what we must look like to birds. You know, birds must look around and say, God, they're boring. They don't even sing much the way we do. So I'm seeing the world through bird eyes. And this question of bird beauty, you know, the peacock's tail, the flamboyant, extra colorfulness and display and song that an awful lot of birds spend a lot of their time doing, particularly male birds, intrigued the heck out of Darwin. Mainly because, to start with, he was really worried. He couldn't explain this problem. You know, you could explain almost everything about biology in terms of survival of the fittest, but he couldn't explain this in terms of survival of the fittest because peacock's tail does not help a peacock survive. It hinders its survival. And he actually wrote this letter to his friend Asa Gray in 1860 saying, "The sight of a peacock's tail when I gaze at it makes me feel sick." And this is what he meant is, I'm really struggling to explain the evolution of beauty. Because my rivals have a very good explanation for it, which is that it was put on earth to please human beings by God, right? Of course, that's why it's there. It's so that we can enjoy looking at it. And he needed to have a better explanation for that. And he came up with this explanation, argued about it for nearly 10 years, particularly with his friend Alfred Russel Wallace, who disagreed with him, wrote a book mainly about this, Descent of Man, it was called, but it was mainly about sexual selection, and kind of lost the argument in his lifetime. And the argument he put forward was that there is a female preference for beauty in most birds. Females have an aesthetic desire to have an attractive mate. And his rivals said, this is ridiculous. Birds are stupid creatures. They don't have aesthetic desires and appreciations. They haven't been to Oxford University. They can't, look at art and appreciate it. That's complete nonsense. And anyway, why would they have this preference? And Darwin didn't have a very good answer to that last question. And a guy called Fisher in the 20th century came along with a better explanation. But before that, Wallace's rival explanation was, well, okay, to some extent, they do like their mates to look beautiful because that's a way of making sure you get a healthy mate. And that idea still dominates the debate today. And I think it's wrong. I think it's not entirely wrong, but I think it's not the main reason. The main reason that birds end up beautiful is because one sex, usually the females, is highly selective and desperately keen to make sure they have a flashy mate. Now, why? Because they want flashy sons who will then get mates. That's the argument. Once you put that logic in, that they don't want a healthy mate, they want a sexy mate, because that way they can have a sexy son. Once you see it as seduction by the hottest rather than survival of the fittest, you realize it's actually a very different process from natural selection, and a much more creative, much more arbitrary, much more random process that will produce the ridiculous variety of plumages that you see in the birds of paradise, in pheasants and peacocks, and particularly this species that I love watching called the black grouse, where the males gather together at dawn every day for months on end to fight and dance and sing. And it's exhausting. And there's anything from a dozen to 2 dozen males on site at any one time, and each has his own spot, a very small little territory on this thing called the lek. And the females turn up for a few days each year, and they wander around like they're in a shopping centre, window shopping, these males, and then they walk up to one and say, right, you can mate with me. And they nearly always choose the same one. Now, why are they doing that? Because they're desperate to make sure, unconsciously, of course, that their own sons get to win the genetic jackpot in the next generation. That's the extraordinary argument that is Darwin's strangest idea, and the one that I think has never been fully appreciated.
For this book, you actually went out and did, I mean, you've always enjoyed bird watching, right? And
Yeah, this book was an excuse to go bird watching.
can you talk about the birds that use plastic objects
Oh,
to
yeah,
make
yeah.
art? And
Well, the birds in which this procedure has gone furthest and weirdest are these Australian birds, Australia and New Guinea, called the Bowerbirds. And in that species, the male builds this thing called a bower, which is usually a sort of tunnel of grass, very beautifully constructed. And then they decorate it with coloured objects. And the satin bowerbird uses blue objects, and the great bowerbird uses white, red, and green objects. And the golden bowerbird uses flowers and lichen, but they have their own specific things. And they make an art installation. And some of these satin bowerbirds, they had bottle tops and ballpoint pens and all sorts of things. And one of the great bowers that I watched he had decorated his bower with a toy hand grenade and a toy tiara, as you do, because he'd picked these things up from someone's garden where their children had been playing. And what's so extraordinary, these guys have invented art, and the female won't mate. I mean, she will mate with the male that has the best display. We know this because there have been experiments where you enhance the bowers of some bowerbirds by putting extra bits of blue plastic around it, and you damage the other ones by taking bits away. And sure enough, the mating success of that male goes up or down according to what you're doing to his art collection. So come and see my etchings has become a genuine thing in some birds. And this, for me, really does show that it's not about, your disease resistance or something. I mean, it may be a bit, but mainly it's about, your ability to attract a mate is itself a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that's what you want your sons to have.
that, I think, is a fascinating anecdote about, so there were people that did experiments that were modifying the displays and altering. Who was doing those experiments with the modification of the plastic composition of the
Australian scientists.
so those birds, so they're using trash.
Well, not usually. I mean, of course, before mankind, there was no blue plastic around, but there were blue feathers and blue flowers, and that's what they were using. But and if you go into right out into the outback now, the great bowerbirds are using white bones and white shells and things like that. But if you go near a town, as I did, then they're using plastic hand grenades and tiaras and other bits of plastic and glass. So, yeah, in a sense, it's rather awful to see this example of litter poisoning the world. But in another sense, the birds are just doing exactly what human artists do and saying, I want to use artifacts in my art.
Can you talk a little bit about birds, the sort of sexual reproduction being a little different from humans? Like how reproduction in birds, I guess I'm saying most birds don't have penises, right?
That's right. I have a whole chapter on how birds lost the penis. We think birds did originally have penises, and some birds do. Ducks do. And from the phylogeny, it's pretty clear that they originally did have penises, and then they lost them. And there's a guy called Richard Prum at Yale University who's also written a very good book about sexual selection called The Evolution of Beauty. And he makes the argument that, and he actually did some experiments on the loss, on the sort of lack of penis in birds. When a bird gets on top of another bird, their cloacas, their multi-purpose openings, basically have to just come together, and then the sperm goes from one hole to the other, as it were. Now, this gives the female much more control over whether or not insemination happens. She literally can refuse to position herself such that it can happen. And Richard Prum's argument is that this is the reward females are after in terms of getting control of sexual selection, in terms of this female choice theory, which seems to be a very big part of bird sex, as females being very selective about who they mate with, in order to breed beauty into males, as it were. And that one of the ways the females have been able to control sexual reproduction is by essentially breeding males to have no penises, if you see what I mean. And there's some, the most striking evidence for that theory is that the birds that do have a penis, like ducks, do indulge in some pretty unpleasant coercion when it comes to sexual reproduction. I'm reluctant to use the word rape, but it's a pretty good metaphor for what's happening, and it occasionally results in the death of the female if it's too violent. This doesn't happen in birds that don't have penises. So there's something there that is really quite intriguing about the which sex gets control of the process of insemination.
Are you familiar with like the concept, like the just so stories, like Rudyard Kipling just so stories to try? Is there a way, I guess, so do you want to explain what the concept of a just so story is and why I'm bringing it up perhaps is?
It's a very good point. How the elephant got his trunk, is one of the just so stories. The baby elephant goes down to the water, and the crocodile grabs hold of his trunk and pulls, and the trunk got longer and longer, and that's how the elephant got his trunk. That's a fantastic and stupid explanation, but it's logically consistent, and that's what a just so story is, as it were. It's an explanation that fits the facts, but for which you've got absolutely no evidence. I guess that would be the definition of a just so story in this context. And yes, I think this story about how the birds lost their penises has elements of that in it, in the sense that we haven't found a way to test it. Well, except for the little bits which I mentioned about ducks and things like that. And that's the trouble with a lot of evolution, is that you're dealing with a pathway, not a rule. You're dealing with a history, not a principle. You're saying it happened this way. It could have happened a different way. And I think that's a really important difference between, say, physics and biology that is much maligned. I wrote a whole book called The Evolution of Everything, in which I argued that, things like languages evolve, things like institutions evolve, things like technology evolves, in the sense of trial and error, survival of the fittest, descent with modification, all these features. And they aren't governed by physical rules about the world. They're governed by this thing called path dependence. There's a new book by a guy called Mark Velland, a professor in Canada, called Everything Evolves, very like my title, The Evolution of Everything. And he's making a similar argument. And he says, I think we need to divide the sciences up into those that are looking for rules like physics and chemistry, and those that are looking for histories like evolution and linguistics and things like that. It's quite an interesting argument.
Yeah, it gets to the central point of, can you do an experiment to test the hypothesis that emerges, one of these evolutionary
Absolutely.
hypotheses? And one of the, I study bacteria, and it's easy to do evolutionary experiments in bacteria. Like, you can control, you can
Absolutely.
sort of put the same thing in different environments and then quickly see how those evolve to. And I guess maybe that's what I'd like to end with this. A lot of people are interested in how these types of, or like, how would sexual selection impact humans? Or how do you see that in terms of, like,
Yep.
how does what we
Well,
learn in birds impact what we see in humans?
Geoffrey Miller wrote a book 25 years ago called The Mating Mind, in which he argued that the rapid explosion of the human brain might have been caused by the need for solving practical problems on the savannah, or it might have been caused by the need for social ability to solve what's going on in a complex society. But it might also have been, or instead have been, caused by something else, which is that we might have just woken up one day and decided that we wanted to mate with people with big brains. And the evidence for that is that we use our brains for seduction in all sorts of ways, singing songs, writing poetry, doing art, whatever it is, telling jokes. There's a whole raft of ways in which the way humans use their brains is very much about showing off to members of the opposite sex. And maybe that explanation needs to be taken seriously. Now, all Geoffrey Miller is doing at this stage is saying, I don't see why my idea should be fringe and everyone else's ideas should be mainstream. I think this is just as good a explanation as any other. Can we please put it on an equal footing? But what neither he nor his critics, frankly, can do is come up with a good way of testing this up. Why did brains start getting bigger about 2 million years ago at quite an accelerating rate in Africa? It must have been an incredibly painful process, quite literally, because it meant that women had to die in large numbers because they couldn't get big brain babies out through their pelvises. How else did pelvises get bigger? By natural selection, the death of women and babies. So it was not a cost-free thing to have bigger brains. There must have been some enormous advantage in this expansion of the human brain. How do we test it? And you're absolutely right, Bryce, and it is a very valid criticism of much of the stuff we talk about in evolutionary biology. How the hell do you test these ideas? And I'm, because I write about this stuff, I get letters from people and emails and messages saying, I've just had this great idea. How about it? And I always write back and say, well, it's a good idea, but how are you going to test it? And they usually go quiet at that point because that is, in the end, the gold standard of a scientific explanation is, how do you test your idea?
And in this case, it's quite important because obviously, like, the idea that those who learn from the past, who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it, but those who learned how evolutionary trajectories, led us to where we are in the present, the idea would be that we can actually bend the future to our will, potentially, I guess, in one way. I mean, that's kind of why we see a lot of people. The point is that people make all kinds of policies and they have, good intentions, and then these policies turn out to be disasters.
There is a respectable argument that the one place where we are really bad at gathering empirical evidence of whether you're right or wrong, is in policy. Do we do double-blind controlled experiments on different policies for, drug use or defense spending or whatever it might be? No, we don't. Should we? Yes. And there was actually a little bit of an attempt in the Cameron government in the UK about 10 years ago to do that, to say, let's find a way of doing some, we'll actually test 3 different policies in 3 different areas of the country and see which one gets the best results. And very quickly it got shut down because somebody complained that, I got the bad policy and the other guy got the good policy, or something like that. But you're absolutely right that's, we go about setting up policies for vast areas of life and huge chunks of the population, affecting people's lives in massive ways, on a hunch of what's going to work, rather than on a proper empirical evidence of what works.
With that, I will end this conversation, Matt. I appreciate your time.
I've talked too much and listened too little. I think I should have been learning from you on this.
What? No, Matt. As I said, no. Yeah, I always enjoy talking to you, and at the times we've met in person, I've found I really enjoy hanging out with you in person. You're one of the. I mean, you're just very genuinely just a very nice, gracious person who's also incredibly intelligent. So, I think you're somebody that really I've been blessed to have had you sort of enter my orbit through this unfortunate situation of working on COVID origins and gain of function.
Well, I take my hat off to you for being very persistent in trying to get at the truth of a really, really important question, the most important one of our lifetime, frankly.
Well, and with that, I'll thank Matt again, and this has been Science from the Fringe. Take care, everybody.